everyone. Welcome to this session titled Break the Roles, Intersectionality in Gender. We're so excited to have everyone joining from different parts of the world. It's been a really exciting summit so far, and I hope that you've all been engaging on social media as well, and will do so throughout this session. I'm joined by 4 different speakers from different parts of the world for this discussion today, who will briefly introduce themselves before I introduce what we'll be talking about in this session. Patrick, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, Glennis. Hi, everybody. My name is Patrick Kaziak Alvarado, and I work for the Open Government Partnership as a program officer. And I'm based in Chicago, Illinois, in the United States.
Great, thank you, Patrick. Tanya.
Hi, my name is Tania Martinez. I work for the Instituto de Liderazgo Simón de Beauvoir in Mexico. I'm the Social Innovation and Citizen Participation Officer. Coordinator, sorry. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Ms. Magda.
Hello, everybody. My name is Magda Mkretasema. I'm joining you from Addis Ababa, Ethiopia today. I work for the African Union Commission, more specifically for the African Governance Architecture Secretariat. And I work as a democracy and governance expert. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Nafisa?
Hi, everyone. My name is Nafisa Ferdos, and I'm a young feminist researcher. I work for Restless Development and Global Youth-Led Accountability Programs for Gender Equality and Sexual Rights, based out of New York.
Fantastic. And of course, my name is Glynis. I'm the Deputy Director at Restless Development Sierra Leone, and I'm also the founder of an organization called She Can, We Can, empowering and building up young female leaders across Africa. So this session today is called Break the Roles, Intersectionality in Gender. I'm sure many of you as young people have experienced a form of barrier that has prevented you from accessing a space of influence, power, decision-making, either because of your age, your gender, your sexuality, your physical or non-visible ability. One way or another, intersectionality has played a role in your ambition to get to where you want to get to bring about change. And we are going to be discussing today how we can break down those barriers to really move into those spaces of decision-making and influence as young people, despite the labels that society has placed on us. And I'm really excited about this panel that we've got here, who are coming with a range of expertise and lived experiences of this to help us to understand what opportunities are available to us as young people to overcome some of these challenges that we are faced every day. So the first question that I want to put to the panel is, what actions should government and civil society take to be more inclusive of young people and marginalized communities? Patrick, would you like to start?
Yes, thank you so much, Glennis. Yeah, so I think the first step in achieving, truly inclusive participation, whether it be young people, LGBTQIA plus communities, and for those of you who don't know, that's lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, intersex and asexual communities or indigenous people, I think, is to ensure that there are those enabling conditions for participation of historically marginalized communities. And so what I mean by enabling conditions, I mean accessibility, right? Both physical, linguistic, political accessibility. When I talk about physical accessibility, I'm talking if you're working with groups of people who experience physical disability, is your meeting space accessible, right? If you're meeting with indigenous people or immigrant communities, are there translators? Are there linguistic ability, is there linguistic accessibility for these folks to participate? And then politically, right, is there civic space? Is there access to justice for people? And then finally, safety, right? It's physical and emotional safety of being in these spaces. There are many places in this world where being a part of the LGBTQI plus community is criminalized. And unfortunately, you cannot fruitfully engage in governance if your very existence is deemed illegal or illegitimate. And so before we can include historically marginalized communities into the co-creation and implementation and oversight of government policies, we need to ensure that these spaces do not replicate the very violence that these communities are facing in their daily lives. So I think, using plain language, everyday language is also critical when reaching out to folks in new groups to bring them into governance. We want to ensure that folks who have the least amount of formal education can participate in governance, and oftentimes there's a lot of jargon used that everyday people might not understand. And then finally, I think governments need to actively seek out these communities, right? Open government teams can create connections and linkages with other departments that are already working with these communities. But it would be remiss not to mention that we're talking about communities who have historically and continue to be subjected to institutionalized discrimination oftentimes at the hands of government. So there is a historical mistrust that needs to be addressed by government in order to move forward with these community partnerships.
Most certainly. At times, we see governments reaching out to marginalized groups to meet a quota or to say that, yes, they've included them, but they've not actually thought or recognized the added value in having them involved from the very beginning, from being at the table, shaping the discussion, shaping what the strategy and the direction is going to look like. Nafisa, what would you like to say on this question?
Hi. I think we've known for a long time what actions we want government and civil society to take to make spaces more inclusive. It's increasing the resources for youth civil society and increasing meaningful youth engagement and representation. At Restless Development, we see this as moving beyond tokenism and enabling young people's decision-making power and leadership in policy and advocacy spaces. In 2019, we launched the Global Consensus Statement on Youth-Led Accountability, which was created by young people themselves and outlines in very clear terms what are the terms of youth engagement that we demand from government. And also it's about expanding agendas. I think young people and young feminists are at the forefront of organizing against the rollback of rights and rising fundamentalisms globally. And the challenge for governments and civil society is not to see this momentum as something that happens on the street, but to bring it into the right spaces as youth-led agendas.
Very right. If we say we want to break the roles, we need to set our own agenda. We need to set our own roles and set our own standards. Tanya, what would you like to say on this topic?
Yeah, well, according to different analyses that were made and served as inputs for the 2030 agenda, the priority agendas for youth are education, knowledge and skills, employment, decent jobs, income, opportunities to get out of poverty, health, sexual and reproductive health and rights, and political participation in terms of accountability, access to information, and to rights. So youth mainly seek to be recognized as right holders and to have meaningful participation that is actually real in the process and agendas that impact their daily life. In this sense, it is about youth being the target of government actions, but also being seated at the table, participating, designing, monitoring, and evaluating those government actions, and also being able to have the conditions or circumstances that allow all kinds of young people to lead these changes. So in terms of open government tools, it could be generate disaggregated information on children, adolescents, and youth, and know the responsibilities of the representatives in government, as well as those of the government entities and ministries, and also have the information to be able to monitor and hold these people and entities accountable, to actively and significantly participate in institutionalized mechanisms for civil society participation, and also, among many other things, to use the use of communication technologies, taking into account each context, allowing access to information, accountability, and meaningful participation to the plurality of youth.
Exactly. Thank you so much in there for us to propose. Magda.
All right, thank you so much. Three quick important steps to just quickly answer your question. And number one is it's very important to have a strategy or a policy that makes sure that youth engagement or women engagement or any other marginalized communities engagement. I think from my own experience within the African governance architecture, one of the most important piece of documentation we have was the youth engagement strategy and women engagement strategies. For us, those two documents sort of made engagement possible, and it sort of moved engagement from an ad hoc basis to an institutionalized platforms. So it kind of warrants or even forces institutions to conform towards inclusion. Number two, we need to be able to provide platform for dialogue for youth, women, and also all of these marginalized groups as well. For me, engagement starts with providing a space, a safe space for young people, for women to come together and talk about different issues. For us, I think, based on my own experience, that sort of made us provide a space to young people, to allow them to use that space to share experiences and also showcase their work at times. The other one I think was mentioned by Nafisa, but it's engagement. I think it's important to move from participation to engagement. And the reason why we named our document engagement is that engagement is beyond participation, beyond numbers. Meaningful engagement is even more important because it needs to go beyond participation. And it also moves to co-creation, co-leadership of young people and women engaged in so many different ways, whether it's advisory boards or reference groups, or even working together with adults or even people in leadership to make decisions and co-create projects. The other one and the last one is the importance of collaboration. I think no one can do the inclusion alone. You can't, it's not possible. It's important to create alliances, more specifically unlikely alliances, build bridges, and work together with different partners to achieve whatever that we want to achieve in terms of inclusion. If you're a gender equality advocate, work with men. If you're working on different kinds of inclusion, think outside of the box on how you can push the envelope. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Something you said really resonated with me because for some time I've been going back and forth in my own mind about how much is our youth parliaments moving us forward in regards to inclusion and having separate spaces for women to discuss things, and whether that is actually truly inclusive or is it a space that segregates us. But what you said about having platforms for dialogue made me realize that actually that platform being provided basically just signifies that there is recognition of the value that we have to add. It's a first step. And then the second step is for us to be able to move into the broader decision-making space where we can not just speak to ourselves as young people, as women, or as persons with disabilities, but actually influence other stakeholders, other individuals as well. So a lot of really interesting points that you've raised. Magda, I want to stick with you and I want to ask you about how institutions like the UN and the African Union can better hold governments accountable for their commitments towards achieving inclusive and representative governance. We know that we have so many different tools, so many different policies. There are several meetings that are held every year where you see people traveling to discuss their progress. But how do you think we can raise the bar in regards to the way that we hold governments accountable for trying to achieve inclusion? They also have targets of how many women they want to see in parliament, or how many persons with disability they want to see represented. How do you think we can make improvements in holding governments accountable?
Right, thank you, Glenys. I think before we talk about accountability, I think it's important to talk about how these intergovernmental institutions work. For me, these intergovernmental institutions, more focusing on the African Union, is made up of member states, which is your own representatives from your own member states, ambassadors. They're called Permanent Representative Council, represent their own government here in the AU. Now, it's very significant, that information, but, and they created the organization, but also they still hold significant amount of decision-making within the union and also the commission as well. More than that, it's funded by member states. The African Union is funded by member states. Of course, partners would also contribute, but that's also a very big, important thing that we need to underline. Now, when we go to the African Union and its roles, the African Union is an important organization that mainly sets standards, do a lot of other things, but sets standards, norms for all, for member states and for all. Now, in terms of accountability, coming back to your question, African Union sets standards on different thematic areas, in inclusion, on women, on youth. There are a plethora of conventions and treaties that sort of give a benchmark, if you will, to member states on what they need to be able to achieve. Now, going back to those treaties, it's also very, very important to realize that if a member state, your own country, where you come from, whether it's Ethiopia or Kenya, if member states do not accede to those treaties, sign it, ratify it, and agree to be bound by those treaties or conventions, there's really less likely to be there's really less likely to be an accountability mechanism for the African Union. Now, once member states sign into a convention, they also have another layer of ways whereby member states can report back to the African Union. It's called the state reporting mechanism, and it exists on the UN system as well. So member states come back to the African Union, report on this, that, and the other that they have agreed to on the conventions. So those are kind of the accountability mechanisms that the African Union sort of uses to make sure that member states are really applying what they're doing. But the real question is, and I think there's so many people that will agree with me, is that how many of these ratified conventions really do get implemented? And that's a huge problem. But for me, moving on from that, I think the real responsibility for me beyond the African Union is within the civil society organizations, advocacy institutions, lobby groups, women groups, youth groups, nationally, grassroots groups, individuals, even think tanks, I would say also media as well, academics, can put pressure on their own member states, on their own government to sign, ratify all of these conventions, relevant conventions to inclusion, but also most importantly, implement, because that's where we see a lot of our member states fail. But for me, I want to hone on the need for advocacy. I think it needs to be targeted, multifaceted, and very, very intentional. I know a lot of the organizations make that mistake of just making noise, but not really making anything come out of that. But there needs to be a lobbying aspect, working behind the scenes, engaging with different ambassadors, decision-making, people sitting in different places, creating alliances, like I said earlier, and pushing the agenda of inclusion forward. Yeah. Thank you
so much. I think that is so true. This morning, we heard in the Pathways to Parliament session about the successes of the Not Too Young to Run campaign. It's not an organization, it's a campaign, and the amount of increased number of young people that have been elected to Parliament because of that campaign. We shouldn't underestimate the power of advocacy. Neither should we underestimate the role that grassroots actors, civil society, ordinary citizens can play in pushing this, demanding for better representation and inclusion. And you also made me think about who holds the power to break the roles. Should we be looking to big institutions, or should we be looking within ourselves to push that agenda and break the roles ourselves and recreate the image and the identity we want to see represented? Moving on to my next question, which is for Patrick. How can open government help remove the social, political, or environmental conditions that contribute to making people who face racism, homophobia, ageism, more vulnerable people? How can it make them realize their rights as civil society, as ordinary citizens? Sorry.
No worries. Thank you so much, Glennis. Yeah, so I think it's first important to mention, government is in part responsible for the social and political conditions that enable things like racism and transphobia. Racism and transphobia and other isms are not simply about interpersonal conflict. These are intricate systems of power and oppression that are often upheld by the state, right? And so open government at its core is accessible government, right? Government without barriers. And so open government seeks to ensure a more transparent, responsive, accountable, and inclusive government that works for everyone, right? And so it is for that reason that I personally believe that any work that government is doing to ensure greater access to those who have been historically marginalized or disenfranchised is open government work, right? And we often see this being done in various open government partnership countries and within what I would call traditional areas of open government, right? Civic participation, citizen participation, access to information, beneficial ownership, right? So for example, Costa Rica, the national government of Costa Rica in 2017 had a commitment through the open government partnership that sought to implement tools and mechanisms to promote a greater defense of rights for the LGBTQIA+ community. And what that looked like was having first a dialogue between government and civil society organizations who are working on these issues to come together and to just talk, right? And then after that, there was a training component in which it was used by the government to train public servants, both within the central government institutions as well as autonomous institutions, on how to use best practices when working with the LGBTQI+ community, right? However, there are various policy areas that I think are not routinely discussed in open government spaces that from an inclusion standpoint are in fact open government, at least in my eyes, right? And so given this conversation is about gender and intersectionality, I'm gonna use this quickly to highlight an institutional barrier that many folks who are transgender, non-binary, and gender non-conforming may face in regards to access to government. Myself, I identify as non-binary, which means I'm not a man, I'm not a woman, I do not believe in the gender binary. And I exist outside of that, right? And I'm often excluded, and people who look, who are more starkly, I would say, gender ambiguous, receive a lot more, I would say, discrimination and violence than I do. And so I hold a lot of privilege in these spaces, right? I'm white, I'm very large, I'm often man assumed, so people think I'm a man, right? And so I hold a lot of privilege in these spaces. And so meaningful civic participation often includes exercising your right to vote, or to access public services such as healthcare, right? And that requires identification. And identification documents that accurately depict a person's gender are imperative to the physical and emotional safety of many trans and gender non-conforming people. However, there are many countries that require transgender people to receive sterilization, thus rendering them incapable of having their own children, right? And so these eugenics policies are inherently violent as they pigeonhole trans people into either receiving a medically invasive surgery that they may not have any interest in getting, or forego that surgery and have a gender marker on their identification that then puts them at, in a lifetime of ridicule and harassment at the hands of government officials, at the hands of doctors, or anyone else who might ask for those forms of identification, right? And so when governments allow trans people and non-binary and gender non-conforming people to self-identify on all forms of social government, on all forms of government identification, that will enable a more meaningful and safe engagement for people to actually engage, right? And so I think what I'll leave this is, I think we must begin to explicitly be intentional about our inclusion of historically marginalized communities, right? Seeing as many of these folks have been intentionally excluded by governments for many years, right? And so I want to leave you all with one example of an explicit inclusion of particularly trans women in a national law. This is not through Open Government Partnership, but the national government of Uruguay has a very progressive law on gender-based violence. And the law reads, the purpose of this law is to guarantee the effective enjoyment of a woman's right to a life of free of gender-based violence. It includes women of all ages, trans women, women of various sexual orientations, socioeconomic status, territorial belonging, belief, cultural and racial origin, and disability without any distinction or discrimination. By simply including the line trans women, by including indigenous women, by including women of various sexual orientations, we are automatically offering protections to folks that have never existed before in the past.
Thank you so much, Patrick. So many valid points. We really need to be at the table when such policies and legislation are being shaped. We need to be part of the discussion when it's being considered who is recognized, who is counted in society, and we've got so much to do. We've come a way in the journey, but we still have so much to do and so much to achieve. Tanya, I want to turn to you. Can you tell us about some of Mexico's Open Government Partnership commitments to provide access to reproductive rights to young people, and what were some of the barriers that you experienced in trying to achieve those?
Yeah, here in Mexico, one of the commitments related to gender and other historically vulnerable groups is the sexual and reproductive rights for young people commitment. Through this one, we want to generate and implement effective mechanisms of proactive transparency, accountability, and citizen participation to improve the provision of sexual and reproductive health services. All this within a human rights framework and with gender as a cross-cutting issue along with intercultural perspective. In Mexico, young and indigenous people are discriminated against and abused on a daily basis, which is why they have known or poor access to their rights, among which are the sexual and reproductive ones. Mexico has the highest adolescent birth rate of all the member countries of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which is why sexual and reproductive health services are essential and an invaluable tool to prevent early or unwanted pregnancies. So there are 2 mandatory regulations here in Mexico that allow adolescents and young people to have access to sexual and reproductive health services without conditioning this care and or the delivery of supplies. At the same time that they allow victims of sexual violence to receive HIV post-exposure prophylaxis, emergency contraception, and voluntary interruption of pregnancy, only by requesting it. However, adolescents, young people, and indigenous women are still lacking access to these services and supplies that should be provided through these regulations. So we want to generate information as well as institutionalized mechanisms that allow to improve the implementation of these regulations with meaningful participation of youth and indigenous people throughout the whole process. In February, we started, civil society organizations, the Health Ministry, the Women's Institute, the Population Council, among other government bodies that are key in delivering these services, we began working for the implementation of this commitment. However, in April, it started to be difficult to keep advancing in the implementation of the commitment, given that all or most of all of the resources have been allocated to the COVID-19 response. So currently we are taking up the work with the government agencies, and since the pandemic raised the need to recognize these services as essential also, the sexual and reproductive health services, and in this sense, raised the need to maintain its provision even in emergency scenarios. So now we are working towards ensuring the access and the quality of these services for all people, but mainly for these 2 groups of population because they are very vulnerable here in Mexico.
Thank you so much, Tanya. I mean, I think something that really resonates with me is recognizing that we are right holders, we have rights as citizens, whether it's a pandemic or it's not a pandemic. We have the right to access to information, to be recognized by decision makers, to contribute to meaningful decisions, not just when there isn't a pandemic, and then when there's a pandemic, all of a sudden, we're kind of pushed to the side and commitments towards including us are pushed to the side. But we should be recognized throughout because we're all part of this process. We're all going through COVID-19 and we need to continue to advocate for this. We need to continue to raise our voice and be the ones, like I said before, to break the roles, for them to see us and our relevance, regardless of whether there's a pandemic or there isn't a pandemic, that we have something to offer. As someone who used to work in the humanitarian world, you have something called the humanitarian core principles, and a lot of organizations apply them to humanitarian setting, which is basically about inclusion, involving everyone in every step of the program design and implementation. But we really need to think about how we are recognizing people, acknowledging what they have to offer, acknowledging their rights, implementing our commitments, regardless of whether there is COVID-19 or if there isn't COVID-19. I now want to move over to Nafisa, who's been doing a lot of work with technology to reach marginalized groups. And I really would like to hear from you, Nafisa, about how you've seen technology being used to go beyond the gendered barriers and stereotypes that we see in society, to be able to reach the most marginalized, ensuring that their voice is heard and that they're counted and that they're contributing to decisions that are being made about them.
Thanks, Glynis. I think we talk about the digital gender gap and reaching marginalized communities a lot, but only in terms of access and not enough about design and decision making. And we have to recognize that the United Nations Security Council in 2016 declared the internet as a human right. And this has been ratified by many national governments. So digital rights are human rights. Access to the internet are human rights. So if we think of the internet on the same level as we do other rights, like access to education, the right to healthcare, the right to live free of gender-based violence, then we see that demanding free, affordable internet access is part of our human rights vocabulary. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, digital inequality is front and center, right? As we see the closing of schools, community health providers, youth centers, increasing the need for more access to telemedicine, digital information and resources, and e-learning are more essential than ever. Take e-learning. As things stand now, it's simply not equally accessed in the global South nor in the global North. Young people, especially low income, disabled, girls and young women, rural young people are feeling the impact of unequal internet access as it limits their rights to education, health, bodily autonomy, and other basic needs. So for restless development, we see this inequality as a fundamental issue of power and justice. Young women, sexual minorities, people with disabilities, and other marginalized groups who have faced historic discrimination can't just be seen as passive recipients of technology or access to technology, but instead they have to be stakeholders and designers themselves. And in my experience, the most successful examples of technology being used to go beyond gendered barriers and reaching marginalized communities are those where communities are meaningfully engaged and design their own terms of participation. At Restless, one of the programs that kind of tries to practice this is our Youth-Led Accountability for Gender Equality program in India and Tanzania, where we're putting young people and gender equality at the center through youth-led research and youth-led advocacy that uses technology to mobilize and organize young people. When young women are the designers of the content, of the campaigns, of apps, of advocacy actions, and the use of technology, that's when the gap begins to get filled.
Thank you, Nafisa. So with that in mind, we've heard quite a lot about the challenges and the barriers that we're all experiencing in our different contexts. I want to shift the focus slightly on to kind of what is out there, what could be done to remove some of those barriers and make things more accessible to all of us as young people. And so the next, we have the SDGs, which all the governments are held accountable to, and they've got their targets that they're trying to meet. The programs are designed around, policies are designed around, they receive funding tied to the SDGs. You have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You have so many international legal frameworks. Do we feel like these international frameworks are going far enough? Or is it simply that we're just, they've set the bar high enough, but we're not doing enough to get there and realize them? Or do we need to really push them even further? Because we're not where we want to be. And that's for everyone.
I think that these international instruments are most of them, the recently ones, are very progressive. For example, the Population and Development Conference here in Latin America, the Consenso de Montevideo, it's a very progressive instrument that actually talks about, for example, sexual rights, which you can't find in many international instruments. But as Magda was mentioning before, this instrument, along with the 2030 agenda, with the action program from Beijing, these very progressive instruments are not binding. So I think that's one of the main obstacles that we, the people and the governments, take advantage of. So the thing that we are doing is to, at least in Mexico, is to try to combine the national laws along with the international instruments. But that's, I think that's the main problem, that they are not binding.
Thank you, Tanya. Any other thoughts on this particular question?
Yeah, I think I also agree. I mean, I think the fact that these kind of high-level international documents are not legally binding is definitely a sticking point, right? We can say that we want to do these things, but if folks are not required to do them or face some kind of repercussion if these things are broken, then it's really hard, right? And I also think that, in particular, in talking about gender, I think it'd be really nice to see some of these international documents a bit more inclusive, right? LGBTQIA plus people are not mentioned in the Beijing Plus 25 document. They're not mentioned in the SDGs. When in fact, transgender folks and people like myself who identify as non-binary and gender non-conforming people, this is our gender. This is gender identity, and we experience gender-based discrimination and gender-based violence, right? But it's often not framed like that. But when in fact, this is actually about gender, right? This has been the deadliest year in the United States of America for transgender people, particularly Black trans women have been murdered, about 32 of them since the beginning of the year, of just this year alone, right? We're talking about a very small subsect of the population, right? So I think, yeah, I think we need to go a little bit further, and it would be great to see the United Nations, especially UN Women and other organizations who are working directly on gender, to begin to very promptly I encourage them to expand their conceptualization of gender, right, and gender-based violence. Gender is not binary, and cisgender people, so cisgender people, for those of you who don't know, are folks who identify with the gender identity that they were given based upon their sex at birth, right? So if you were sex at birth a female and you identify as a woman, you are likely cisgender. And so it's just, important to recognize that cisgender folks are not the only people who experience gender, right? Gender is experienced by every single person. And so making sure that we're actually including some of the also very vulnerable communities that experience gender-based violence, right? Because trans women are women. And so when we're talking about violence against women, we're also talking about violence against trans women. And while I know that, I don't think that's an international narrative, and I think that could be explored, definitely coming from higher ups.
That is definitely a step that needs to be taken. Nafisa, sorry.
No, sorry about that. I would add on that, these international instruments are 20, 30 years old, and the world has really changed since then, both in terms of who you demand accountability from and where accountability lies. So the role of corporate power, for example, the role of internet monopolies and service providers, the internet at all, regional and transnational trade agreements, these all did not exist when UN mechanisms were set up. And so we're seeing a systematic disenfranchisement also of young people and a crackdown on rights, a rise in gender ideology like we've never seen before, making it even harder for rights holders to hold their governments and other stakeholders accountable to these mechanisms. So, I think it's time to really simply question some of the norms that we've gotten used to. For example, veto power. When national governments are no longer the only power holders that determine rights, what right is it for them to have veto power in UN mechanisms? I think it's also time to recognize the role of movements more, and the power of feminist movements in particular, who are creating a culture of accountability. And that's not necessarily only targeting UN and government spaces, but it's really creating a culture change across national national context.
I would like to jump in.
Hello, Gladys?
Yes, so I'm thinking in lines of what Nafisa has just said, and I'm thinking these international instruments, yes, they are there, but then we lack a proper system in holding our leaders accountable and also monitoring and evaluating. Are these systems really working for us? How are they working? What are the best strategies? So in most cases, you'll find that it is only at international levels that the monitoring and evaluation usually take place. But when it comes to even grassroots, people are not aware on how, for example, to monitor SDG 1. So we really need to take down this information to the grassroots level. Thank you.
Let me come in, Gladys, really quickly.
Okay.
Without repeating the other panelists, which I definitely agree on what they said, I also would like to mention the issues of financing, in line with application of different instruments, or whether it's SDGs or even Agenda 2063. That's what we call the African Union agendas, similar to SDGs. But it will definitely need to be backed up by proper financing. I mean, you can definitely say that you can do a lot towards achieving it, but unless otherwise, there is a very targeted financing involved, especially for member states to do that, or even pushing member states to allocate certain amount of financing to achieving those goals. I don't think it's going to go very far. But also, I think it's important to realize, more than these frameworks that we've talked about, that there's a need to go further down to the national level and ensure that member states who are party to those conventions need to be capacitated. Finance is one, but also technically on how they can link the SDGs, how can they link the aspirations for Agenda 2063 and implement them in a way that is finance friendly, if I can use that word. So I just wanted to come in and say that. Thanks.
Thank you, Magda. I mean, I feel like a movement is about to start based on this discussion. I'm feeling very inspired, but it's so clear that, you know, power lies within our hands. We do have some power. I think sometimes we feel like all the power is with leaders, stakeholders, big institutions, but we have the knowledge. We know what needs to change. We know what we want for ourselves and what kind of society we want. It's about collective effort and bringing our ideas together, having strategies that are from the grassroots level to national level and international level that can help to reshape these international frameworks, that can really help to reshape national policies and what governments are aspiring to, and what then shapes their policies, as well as civil society. I think we have so much that we can work with as young people, but I think we need to recognize the power that we have and use that in the right way. I think I wanted to stop there and not go into any other questions that I've got prepared because we're quite close to time. I can see a couple of comments and questions in the chat box. I really appreciate everyone's level of engagement in this. This is a really important discussion, one that doesn't end here and can most certainly continue on social media. And we need to keep the conversation going. Like we said, these roles are outdated. A lot of the individuals that are recognized in these international frameworks are also outdated, and the conversation needs to keep going. The campaign needs to keep going. We need to keep pushing for a more representative society where we play a role and where we shape what we want to see. I want to thank everyone for joining this session today. Please stay on the line. We've got another session starting in a few minutes, and we are going to have some more information about that on the screen. If you want to get in touch with or follow any of us on social media, you can see our social media handles on the screen right now. You can find us on Twitter and various platforms. If you want to find out more about the information we shared today, feel free to reach out to any of us on social media. It's been a real pleasure having everyone in the panel and also in joining online take part in this conversation. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.
expectations.
Парламентке жаңы келгенде абдан кооз кийинип алыпсыз. Биздин парламентте ошол кооздоп жүрө бериңиз деген сөздөр көп эле да. Андай sözdör жоголуп баратат парламенттин ичинде.
La primera vez que pedí información pública cuando tenía 22 años, como que no me tomaban en serio con lo que hacía. Y hoy por hoy hemos llevado adelante investigaciones